Here is a clip. This is on MSNBC last night. Chris Hayes had Bernie Sanders on the program last night to talk about college affordability. And Sanders makes it clear that Pete Buttigieg is poisoning the waters in some ways by spreading these sort of right-wing talking points, and he's not having it. Here it is.
What do you say to that argument that there's no reason to pay for people who've been paid full free?
Well, I say Buttigieg is wrong on both counts. Number one, of course, when we talk about making higher education, public colleges and universities tuition-free, we mean not only college, but we mean trade schools as well. There are millions of good jobs out there in construction and all kinds of areas where people are good at working with their hands. They don't want to go to college. And of course, we are going to make tuition free for those people. So what he's saying is not accurate. Second of all, there is the issue of universality. I'm very glad that Mr. Buttigieg is worried that I have been too easy on upper income people and the millionaires and billionaires, that I'm going to allow their kids to go to public colleges and universities. Just, by the way, as they do go to public schools right now, Trump's kids can go to any public school, elementary school, high school in the country, tuition free. But the point is, I happen to believe that when you talk about programs like Social Security, like health care, like higher education, they should be universal. The way you pay for them, and the way I do it, not the way Buttigieg does it, is I do demand that at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, that the very rich will start paying their fair share of taxes, as will corporate America. You pay for it by raising revenue from the very rich, but then you say in a very simple way that any person who wants a higher education, college, trade school should be able to do it. You know, right now, that's what we do with Social Security. It is a popular program. It is a universal program.
I mean, this is the thing, that if you are so inclined to the concept of means testing, there is a very, very effective way of, for all intents and purposes, means testing benefits. You make them universal and you increase taxes in a progressive nature. It is far more efficient than trying to determine whether people qualify. It ends up being far more fair and just. It creates a lot less resent about these programs, and it makes for a better society. It's easy.
This is going to sound rude because it is, but because it just is rude. I don't think Pete Buttigieg is very smart. I think that he is if you listen to him speak, even in that clip we saw when he was talking at the town hall, he sounds like a machine learning algorithm going haywire. And he just throws out words like freedom and ideology and fairness. And then he peppers in some Republican framing, and that's it. And that the appeal of a Pete Buttigieg type figure, it really feels like he is only meant to appeal to other people like Pete Buttigieg, other people who happen to occupy a lot of high level positions across, the politics and the media, who see some kind of affinity with his life story of being a Rhodes Scholar and being a Harvard educated, so-and-so, and being a consultant. And people who have been conditioned to believe that those things are substantial enough to count as being intelligent in some broad, socially valuable way. But then you listen to him say things like, well, we can't, you think it's fair if the children of billionaires go to college? We should be means testing. But that doesn't even make sense on a practical level. Like you mentioned, it's like, because theoretically, I would have to imagine that the cost of creating a bureaucracy to means test
without a doubt
would cost more than paying for the kids to just go to
without
school.
A doubt.
That's the argument of an ideologue, right? That's of a purely or a liar, right?
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, first of all, without a doubt, there is no doubt that to create a system where it would examine individuals whose parents have millions of dollars, right? And then also to examine whether or not are they trying to get around it, and to what extent, not to mention the sort of the problematic nature of just sort of saying like we're going to attribute this wealth to you as a student versus you and your parents. But putting that aside, that mechanism and that effort right there would be would cost more than you would save for the number of people who would actually apply and try and get into these programs. But do you think that do you think he doesn't know this? I mean, don't you think that it's really less of a case of he's not intelligent enough to know this, but rather he is a trained consultant whose job it is to go in and assess the situation and say stuff that makes it sound like he's adding value, even though he may not know what the situation is?
Intelligence is such a vague metric, right? You know, you're talking about Biden challenging people to an IQ test, right? The way we indicate intelligence within our political system is so heavily reliant on.
I guess my point is, I think he's just being. I think he's just a liar.
I think he's being disingenuous. I think he's being a liar. But there are people who actually believe that, right? There are people who think that, wow, he's blowing my mind with facts and logic, right? And like, this is what a smart person sounds like. This is what a smart person, you know, how they consider problems. But from an ethical perspective, it doesn't make sense. From a practical perspective, it doesn't make any sense. It's just pure ideology.
Yep.
Like the only way you can make sense of an argument that we should not provide basic services to the children of billionaires in exchange for being citizens, right? But really to offset taxes is if you just cannot conceptualize why universal programs should be things that exist, why we should have roads, why we should have public school, why we should have any of those things. And that's just neoliberalism. I hate to use the N-word on your show because I know it's a big thing, but just the idea of going back to, like, you know, what about trade schools? What about people who don't want to go to college? You know, the idea, like, the question to that would be, okay, well, what about trade school? We need plumbers, we need electricians, we need all those people, of course, right? But based on the way our system works, it's like, would you support those people who didn't go to college, who didn't go to law school, running for president? Would you support a plumber running for president in your position, or would that be disqualifying? Because if that's the case, if you would not support somebody who doesn't have a very shallow branch of expertise to be in political space you are, then you should support free college. You support giving people the opportunities that you would to advance to the highest level of society. Right? That seems to be a fundamental flaw in that logic, where we have certain we have certain heights that need to be reached. We have certain resources that need to be afforded, like healthcare, that often requires you to have a job that pays for healthcare through employers, which many people who have menial jobs or manual labor jobs don't have. So if you're not in favor of having universal programs, if you're not in favor of supporting universal public education, are you at least in favor of dissolving or having a cultural conversation about, like, you know, changing how we consider that stuff, right?
Yeah.
If you would not let somebody who didn't go to college run for president, then you don't have a right to essentially argue that people shouldn't have everyone should have access to college.
No, he's the most overly credentialed person in the world, and that's his whole shtick. That's his thing. So for him to turn around and say, like, oh, well, the world needs ditch diggers too, it's like a real let them eat cake moment for him.
Right. And on top of which, of course, the programs that he's criticizing include more robust support for apprenticeships for the trades as well as vocational schools. And he has virtually none of that.
I just want to say, I think I agree so much with everything you just said, and we need to do both. Obviously, we need to have those universal programs and support people in all paths, and really genuinely uproot those and you know, I gotta put in a plug for.
But here's the thing: if you were to say to Pete Buttigieg, "Would you support a plumber for president?"
He would pretend.
He would immediately go, "Of course I will. Of course I would. Are you kidding?"
Right.
Yes, absolutely. Right. I've been saying to people around the office,
I will say
we should
that
have more plumbers.
I think you're right, because he's a BSer. But I remember that actually really disturbed me about literally the one thing about Scott Walker that was redeemable was that he was a college dropout who made his way to the governorship. That's objective.
Senator.
No, Scott Walker was governor of Wisconsin.
Oh, Scott Walker. Oh, okay,
Scott
sorry.
Walker.
I thought you were talking about Scotty Brown.
No, Scotty B went through law school, actually. Speaking of not,
I just remember he was
not confusing.
He was a male model, though.
Yeah, not confusing credentials with intelligence.
Right.
That would be a good example right there. But, you know, that was great. That was the one thing I remember reading about Scott Walker. I was like, that's unbelievably impressive.
Right.
And a lot of people, you know, even anecdotally, that was like their first strike against him was not, this guy is one of the most dangerous horrifying records in the country.
Right.
It was, that guy didn't go to college. How could he possibly be president? And that is so toxic and so, and I'll put in a Lula plug. Lula didn't go to college. Best, most strategic president of the 21st century so far.
6 degrees of Lula. Can I just add, as a downwardly mobile child of the professional managerial class who, went to the fancy schools and the faux meritocracy gauntlet, like, they really do convince you that kind of narrow book smarts is the only kind of intelligence that counts and the only kind that matters. And like, I knew that the meritocracy was something of a lie. I knew it on an intellectual level. And then I got to Columbia and I met multiple dudes there who thought that girls peed out of their vagina holes. So that
Wait,
should tell you
what?
something.
No, sorry, good.
As somebody,
Thank you.
as someone with an MPH from the School of Hard Knocks, much like Cory Booker, I will say this though: I have to, at least make the argument that I think that the devaluation of the value of people who have jobs like plumber and and factory workers and manual labor is a result of the, essentially the dissolution of labor organizing.
Right.
It's like, there is not an organized labor movement in the United States of America to advocate for the value of labor, essentially the social value, the cultural value of labor. And so it's easy for someone like Pete Buttigieg, who is just going to pick up a stage and BS and go, oh yeah, of course I support plumbers or electricians or welders running for president, to lie. But we know that he wouldn't, and we know that people who are listening to him would not, because the first thing you hear is about, like, well, they're the most qualified candidate. Who's the most qualified? And
Right.
Pete Buttigieg, I think Chomsky said it, Pete Buttigieg is a walking resume.
Right.
Right, exactly. And also that labor power was the only institutional basis upon which you do produce a Lula, or even at a different time in this country. You just even read some book about the 60s and it's not radical at all, but like in like a conservative Democratic administration like Kennedy, which it was relative to the Democratic Party as far as I understand. And it's like, oh, we need to have a national economic summit. So we're going to have some CEOs, but we need Walter Reuther needs to be there. It was just
Right.
a given
Right.
that labor was at
Labor
the
was a much
center,
bigger part of the Democratic
and they
Party.
were
at
highly
that point.
respected and understood to be extremely important strategists and leaders.
Let's go to the phones. You call them from a 415 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from? 415. 415.